This is the Dallas Morning News.
I'm Talmage Boston, and welcome to this edition of Cross-Examining History, where we explore American history and thought leadership through conversations with esteemed authors. Today, I'm interviewing Pulitzer winner Doris Kearns Goodwin, one of America's leading historians, about her new bestseller, An Unfinished Love Story, A Personal History of the 1960s. The book came out on April 16, 2024, and we did the interview in front of a live audience at the JFK Sixth Floor Museum in Dallas on June 14, 2024. Enjoy.
Hello, everyone. We are so glad to be here. If I could just say, before I started this morning, I was able to take a tour with Stephen of this place. It is an incredible moment. It's so emotional. Not just even what happened on that day, but they have an exhibit now of the days prior to the assassination. And it just makes you realize, you see happy Jackie and happy Jack, and you see them being greeted in other cities. And when they first come here, feeling a sense of welcome. And then you know that fate intervenes at any moment. It's something that could happen to any of us in our own lives. It's got a deeper meaning even, I think, than what we see here. So if you haven't been through this museum, it was a magical experience for me to be here this morning.
Let me start by giving credit to where credit is due, and that is when I found out that Doris was coming to town, and tonight she's going to be doing a program for the World Affairs Council and the Dallas Museum of Art. I begged her and her wonderful assistant, Beth. I've never gotten a chance to interview Doris. All these years, we've known each other, we're friends, but this is my first ever. And so it's only because Doris said, yes, I will do another event in Dallas during the lunch hour. She was delighted when she heard it was going to be at the Sixth Floor Museum. So to give credit where credit's due, thank you, Doris, for having energy that goes beyond all limits for anybody half your age and being with us this morning.
I'm glad to be with Talmage. And I must say, we'll be talking about my book, but he's just finished a book as well, which I gave a blurb to, and it's How the Best Did It, looking at the values and the behavioral patterns and how our great leaders led, and what an important thing for us to understand in this day and age, to look back at the past and get inspiration from those who went before us, who did it right and did it well.
All right, well, let's talk about your wonderful new book, which, of course, is still right up in the top 10, top 3 bestseller list, New York Times, deservedly so. May it stay there a long time. And for those who haven't opened it and aren't familiar with it, Doris, it's a combination memoir of your 46-year friendship / love story with your late great husband, Dick Goodwin, that started in June 1972 when he was 40 and you were 29. And it's also a presidential history book of the 1960s. So much of this joint story, the love story and the presidential history, came as you and Dick were going through over 300 boxes of his personal memorabilia and papers from the Kennedy and Johnson years. And so as you were going through those boxes together, at what point did you say, there's a book here?
I'm not sure we saw it at the beginning. What happened is that Dick had schlepped these boxes around with us our entire married life, and I had peeked into them, so I knew they contained everything: diaries, letters, journals, newspaper clippings of his experience in the 60s. And he was sort of everywhere in the 60s. He worked for John Kennedy in the campaign. He was in the Kennedy White House. And then he went over to Lyndon Johnson, became his chief speechwriter. Then they broke on the war. He was with Senator McCarthy in New Hampshire in the anti-war movement. And then he ended up working with Bobby Kennedy, his closest friend, on his campaign, and was with him when he died. And he was close to Jackie. So he's like Zelig or Forrest Gump. He's everywhere in the 60s. And I couldn't wait till we could go through the boxes. But he felt so sad at the way the boxes, not the boxes had ended, but the decade had ended. The idea that Robert Kennedy had died, Martin Luther King, there were riots in the street, there was campus violence, that he just wanted to look ahead. He didn't want to look backward. Until finally he turned 80. And then one day he came down the steps not long after singing from Oklahoma, "Oh, what a beautiful morning." And I said, "What's going on?" He said, "Well, I think it's now or never. It's time to open the boxes." And then he said, this is typically the way Dick talked in weird fashions, "If I have any wisdom to dispense, I better start dispensing now before it's too late." So we made a pact that we would go through the boxes every weekend, and we'd do it chronologically from the beginning, from the late 50s and the 60s, the early 60s, not knowing or suspending knowledge of the sadness that was going to come later with the assassinations and all the troubling parts of the 1960s, so we could relive it from the excitement and the inspiration of what started in the 60s. And it turned out really to be the last great adventure that we took together before he died. We had talked about my helping him write a book about it, and we still had boxes to go when he died. And yet, somehow he asked me in those last months of his life a promise that I would finish what we had begun together. But once it was no longer my writing a book for him, it had to be me writing the book. And that's why it took so long. It always takes me very long to write these things, but it was a process that I probably loved as much as any other book that I've written on, and I'm so glad I was able to do it.
Well, I've read almost all your books, and this is my favorite, just so you know. Now, every great book has a certain element of tension in it. And as you and Dick plowed through the boxes, you recognized that you each had a decided bias and that your biases were not in harmony. So, what were your conflicting biases, and did they lessen as you went through the boxes?
Now, this was one of the most important things that happened in that many-year experience of going through the boxes. For our entire married life, we argued about JFK and LBJ. He had a great loyalty to JFK, not only because that was his first real introduction to public life, but because he was part of that Kennedy family. He'd gotten close to Jackie and was very, very close to Bobby. And then he broke with LBJ on the war, so there was an anger toward LBJ. Even though his greatest accomplishments occurred with LBJ, I was an LBJ loyalist when I worked for him when I was 24 years old and then accompanied him to his ranch to help him on his memoirs. That really was what set me on a path to becoming a presidential historian. And it's so great to be back in Texas again. So much of my life was spent here. I mean, in those years that I helped him on his memoirs, first I lived in Austin when the papers were here, and then I moved out to the ranch and actually stayed on the ranch while I was working on the memoirs. Mostly I just listened to him talk when I was there. He loved to talk. He talked and he talked and he talked. He talked as we swam in the pool. He talked as we walked around the ranch. He talked as we were waiting for a movie to begin. And I wasn't sure ever why it was that he had chosen me to spend so many hours with. I like to believe it was because I was writing, luckily, the 2 chapters. It was a small team working with him, the 2 chapters that were on Congress and civil rights, the things he wanted to talk about. I also thought that maybe it would be because I came from Harvard and he had a thing about Harvard. He used to say that his father told him, if you brush up against the grindstone of life, you'll have more polish than any Harvard or Yale man ever had. But somehow I never believed him. And I also worried that part of it was, though, that I was a young woman, and he had somewhat of a minor league reputation. So I constantly chattered to him about steady boyfriends, even when I had none at all. Everything was perfect until one day he said he wanted to discuss our relationship, which sounded ominous. He took me to the lake, conveniently called Lake Lyndon Baines Johnson, wine, cheese, red Chuck tablecloth, all the romantic trappings. And he started out, Doris, more than any other woman I've ever known, and my heart sank. And then he said, you remind me of my mother. It was pretty embarrassing, given what was going on in my mind. So anyway, I had a loyalty to Lyndon Johnson. Without a question, those talks became the basis of my first book. And it made me want to study other presidents after that. But that privilege of spending so much time with him made me want to look at them from the inside out rather than from the outside in. So my loyalty was to him, and we constantly argued about it. I would say that Johnson got all the programs through that Kennedy never got through. He would say, but Kennedy inspired those programs in the first place. He would argue that Johnson had kept the war going more longer than John Kennedy would have. And they weren't fun arguments. They were real arguments because I couldn't get out of him. He had grievances toward LBJ, and it wasn't happy that he still felt angry with him and was not able to remember the great times they had together until we went through the boxes. And then going through those boxes and reliving 1964 and 1965, the heyday of civil rights and the Great Society and voting rights, he began to remember emotionally the extraordinary moments that were shared during that period of time. And I remember one night when we went upstairs and he couldn't sleep that night. He said, oh my God, I'm feeling affection for the old guy again. And he really did let those feelings of anger go away. And it's never good to allow grievances to get in your head. And by the time we were in those last months of his life, he really had come to terms with knowing that not only had Johnson made a great contribution to America despite the legacy of the war in Vietnam, but his role had been important in what he was able to do with Lyndon Johnson. So there was a serenity in those last years that the boxes provided. They gave him a sense of purpose every day. He loved joyfully to open them. And I'll be forever grateful that he did save these stupid things all those years. They mattered a lot.
Well, let's start at the beginning in terms of how Dick first engaged with a young senator from Massachusetts named John F. Kennedy, who had aspirations to be president of the United States, and he joined the campaign trail. What were Dick's impressions of John Kennedy as a campaigner?
It was really interesting. This is where, you know that he's going to win the election, but they, of course, didn't know that now. It was a real long shot, or so it seemed at the beginning. And he watched Kennedy grow. That's what was so fun to watch when we went through the materials that he had saved. At the beginning, he said that he spoke so fast, and he didn't let the audience absorb what he was saying. And when they would start clapping or something, he would just rush past it. And when it was over, he'd rush out like a little kid as if he was he'd given a report and he couldn't wait to get back to his seat and not have to stand there anymore. But the great thing was that he would ask the reporters, how did I do? Where did I win them? Where was I losing them? So he grew as a campaigner. But I think what Dick also saw was that not only did he grow, but there was something about that inspiration that it's hard to judge what it means when a person has something that can make other people feel they want to do something. And I think the greatest moment of that was in October of 1960. They flew together on a prop plane that Joe Kennedy had provided for his son. And it was very intimate. There were chairs for Ted Sorensen, the main speechwriter, and Dick. And they would turn into beds at night. And John Kennedy had his own bed at the back of the plane. They had typewriters. They had communications. It was a small traveling circus in a way. So they all got to know each other pretty well. Anyway, in October of 1960, the plane landed outside of Ann Arbor, Michigan. And he was supposed to just simply sleep at the University of Michigan Union that night and go on a tour of the state the next day. But when he got there at 2 a.m. in the morning, 10,000 kids had been waiting for him for 5 hours, chanting his name. Meanwhile, he had no speech prepared for them. He wasn't imagining he would meet them. And Ted and Dick had gone off to the 24-hour cafeteria to get something to eat, so he was on his own. So he just turned around, and he said it was the longest short speech he ever gave, 3 minutes. He just asked them a series of questions about themselves. Would you be willing to give some years of your life to work for people in Ghana and make things better for them by educating them or sharing your skills that you've developed in college? Would you be willing to go to another country? Would you be willing to know that college shouldn't be just a place to get an economic advantage on other kids, a place where you find a purpose and you find almost a vocation? And they responded so adamantly that night. They were cheering wildly. But more importantly, 2 graduate students took up the call, and they sent around a petition, and 1,000 kids signed saying they'd be willing to give a year or 2 of their life to service for America in some foreign country. So they brought those petitions to President Kennedy, to-be Kennedy, Senator Kennedy, and then the next day or 2, he gave a speech, and that was the birth of the Peace Corps. So it came from the kids themselves, and that's the way change so often happens in the country. And also just the inspiration that night, something in his voice, something in his desire, communicated itself to the kids, and it becomes the signature program of the Kennedy administration. So Dick remembers that night with such incredible fondness. And then I got to interview the 2 graduate students. They were now in their mid to late 80s who had started the whole thing, and their memories were still so vivid of what that night meant.
So, of course, we know John F. Kennedy was elected president in a very close election, and to no one's surprise, he chooses Dick to be in the White House with him. Talk about their first day in the White House.
Oh, yeah, this is a great story, I think. What happened is, first, of course, there was the inaugural address, with the famous phrase that becomes the signature also in a larger way as the Peace Corps was, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. And then there was a long parade afterwards, and it was very cold that day. And John Kennedy was not wearing a top coat, so none of his aides could wear a top coat either. They were all freezing. Dick said he couldn't wait till the parade came to an end. Finally, it came to an end, and he decided to go into the West Wing to inspect his new offices. He was so excited to see where he was going to be working. And when he got in there was someone else inspecting his own digs, and that was John Kennedy. So Kennedy came up to him, and he said, "Did you see the Coast Guard contingent?" And Dick could not remember one contingent from another. So then John Kennedy said to him, there wasn't a black face among them. I want us to do something about that. Dick was so excited. It was his first directive as a young aide. He ran up to his office, and he wasn't even sure where the Coast Guard was in the government bureaucracy. He finally remembered that it was in the Treasury Department. He called the new Secretary of the Treasury, Douglas Dillon, and they've instituted a recruitment drive to get the first black to graduate from the Coast Guard cadet, as Coast Guard cadet. And I was able to interview his widow, a wonderful man, Merle Smith, who became a Bronze Star recipient from Vietnam, later became a lawyer for the Coast Guard, became a professor of law, spent his whole life and loved the Coast Guard. And so that story just, again, was making me realize, as Dick said, in those days you felt with a White House telephone you could change the world. They also did a study of how many black Americans were in the government in various positions, and it was miserable statistics that came forward. In the Justice Department, there were 1,000 lawyers, only 10 were black. Only 2% of the Foreign Service was black. So they began to institute programs where blacks would be at all levels of government. So change really did happen from that one experience, instinctive experience of what John Kennedy saw.
Now, as you mentioned, not only was Dick extremely close with John F. Kennedy, but he was also very close with Jacqueline Kennedy. And it was a friendship that lasted until her death in 1994. What was their chemistry? What's your sense, having talked to Dick and so forth? What brought them together and made them such close friends?
I think what it really was, Jackie loved literature and art and poetry, as so did my husband. That was his first love, actually, even more than government in many ways. He'd always wanted to be a writer, a fiction writer or a nonfiction writer. And the two of them had a series of projects that involved the arts. I mean, one of them was a fun night where Dick simply sent a memo to Jackie saying, how about having a dinner to celebrate Nobel Prize winners so that young people in the country can realize that we value science and we value accomplishment and hard work. And they expanded it to become Pulitzer Prize winners as well as Nobel Prize winners. And the dinner became known as a dinner in Camelot. It was just one of those evenings where each one of the Nobel Prize winners was so excited to meet the other ones. They hadn't met each other many, many times. Same with the Pulitzer Prize winners. There was a lot of drinking, a lot of food that was great, beautifully set up. And there was a picture that we had on our wall all those years because Dick had come up with the idea for the dinner. He was able to escort Jackie to the dinner. So you see him walking down the aisle with violins on either side, looking like he's just won the lottery. I mean, he's got this beautiful woman by his side, has this huge grin on his face, and she sent him the picture after JFK's death, and underneath she wrote from Keats, fled is that night. Was it a dream or was I awake? The music is gone. It was much more beautiful than what I just said, but it was the idea that those memories were still hard because there was something special about that time. And while the whole idea of Camelot may be an overblown idea, there was something about that moment that really depicted it for both Jackie and Dick. He also got involved with her in saving the monuments that were going to be flooded by the Aswan Dam in Egypt. And they were able to persuade Congressman Rooney from Brooklyn, who was wondering, why should we be spending money? He said, to save rocks in Egypt? I don't have a single Egyptian in my constituency in Brooklyn. They finally persuaded him that this was important to do. They had philanthropic funds that went. And as a result, the Egyptian government allowed a scrapbook to come to them where they could pick a temple in return. So he and Jackie picked the Temple of Dendur, which is now at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So they had that in common, and they wrote letters to each other after the assassination in those last years, and handwritten letters that Jackie wrote beautifully. There was one from Hawaii. It was in 1966, and she was trying to find a place to live. She didn't think she could live yet in New York or in Washington, so she had went to Brazil and Argentina, trying to find a culture that would make her feel distant from the events that had happened. And Hawaii seemed to be a place where a lot of writers had come. And she wrote him this beautiful letter on Chinese brush lessons she was taking, so it's painted as well as written in her handwriting, talking about whether or not she can deal with what she was still trying to deal with. And maybe she should just go and not think about things as the way the Eastern philosophy did. And she said, you'll understand what I'm saying. I can't tell this to many others because you're a troubled soul, as I am. And then I took that letter and I said, hey, you were really closer to her than I realized. You have a lot more to tell me about. But anyway, it was a close friendship.
Well, you mentioned on the first day Kennedy's decision that we needed to integrate the Coast Guard. But for the first 2 years of his presidency, he was really not an activist on civil rights. It took him watching the nationally televised Birmingham riots and Governor Wallace blocking the door at the University of Alabama that led to his famous TV address. And then a couple months later was the March on Washington, in which both your husband Dick and you were in attendance, although you hadn't met as of that time. But think about that historic day and your favorite memories of it.
Yeah, there was something. I was just 20 years old at that March on Washington. I was in Washington. I was still a college student for the summer, and Dick was working then in the Peace Corps. He had gone from the White House staff to help in the Peace Corps, and we were told not to go to the march. Everybody was given the day off, the government employees were, not to go, but to stay home. They wanted everybody away. They were so afraid there'd be violence at the march. There were 250,000 people there, and they knew there was going to be a large crowd, and they had closed down all the bars. Hospitals could do only necessary surgery. They had 4,000 troops waiting, and more police were on camp, and it was the most peaceful day imaginable. John Kennedy had simply been worried that if the march got out of control, it could hurt the progress of the Civil Rights Bill, which was going through the Congress. And as I say, Dick and I always used to think about where were all the places we met before we actually met, when we were in the same place. And of course, we never saw each other that day, since there were, as I said, these 250,000 other people there. But for me, it was the first time I ever felt I was part of something larger than myself, that I was helping to make something better. I was carrying a sign, Catholics, Jews, and Protestants unite for civil rights. And as we walked together from the Washington Memorial to the Lincoln Memorial, there was that sense of fulfillment somehow, of being, as I said, with somebody that was collectively working toward it. And then we, of course, heard Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. But the moment I remember the most is people all joined hands and we sung, We Shall Overcome. And I remember feeling this is a moment I will never forget. And truly, I never have.
Well, let's talk about you at that age. I mean, you were in college. A year or two later, you'd be in graduate school in Harvard. You were already something of an activist, but none of us knew you then. Describe yourself in your mid-20s during this era of the 60s when so much was going on.
Well, I think when I think about what I cared about at that time, I knew I loved history. I knew I loved history from the time I was a little girl. My father had taught me that mysterious art of keeping score while listening to baseball games, so I could record for him the history of that afternoon's Brooklyn Dodger game. And he would come home, and with all my miniaturized symbols, I went on and on about every play of every inning, but he made me feel I was telling him a fabulous story. He kept my attention. So I thought there's something magic about history to keep my father's attention. He never told me then that all of this was actually described in great detail in the sports pages of the newspapers the next day. So I thought without me, he wouldn't even know what happened to the Brooklyn Dodgers. So that was my love of history when I was really young. It got shaped, as so often happens, from a high school teacher, Miss Austin, who taught us somehow when she would teach us about various figures who'd lived before us, she made us feel that she had known them, that they were vivid, they were so alive in her mind. I remember when she told us about Lincoln dying, she actually started crying. So I felt to myself, of course she must have known him. She couldn't be crying if she didn't know him. But that's what happens when you can feel somebody, even by studying them. So I went to college hoping to be a high school teacher. I went to graduate school still thinking I'd be a teacher. And I wasn't sure what direction my love of history would take until I became a White House fellow and then was able to go down to Washington and dance with Lyndon Johnson the night we were selected. And that's really where it began, although it was a rocky beginning. Even though he did tell me that he wanted me to work directly for him, it wouldn't be that simple. For in the months leading up to my selection, I'd been active in the anti-war movement, like so many young people, and a friend of mine had gone to a big march in New York, and we were troubled by the fact that violence was coming into these marches. People were burning draft cards, construction workers were throwing things back at the marchers. So we went back and wrote a rather nerdy political science article about the need for a third-party candidate to challenge Lyndon Johnson in 1968, hoping it could bring the energy of the anti-war movement into the political process. But we heard nothing. We sent it into the New Republic, and we weren't surprised. We weren't published authors. But then several days after the dance in the White House, the article suddenly appeared on the stands with the title, How to Remove Lyndon Johnson in 1968. I was certain he would kick me out of the program. But instead, surprisingly, he said, bring her down here for a year, and if I can't win her over, no one can. So that began what I talked about earlier, that situation of working on the White House staff with LBJ, accompanying with on his memoirs. And then that's why I became a presidential historian. So that was the young Doris Kearns.
Well, let's talk about the end of the John F. Kennedy presidency. Obviously, November 22nd, 1963, shots rang out from this very building that ended his life. How did that impact Dick's future with then Vice President, soon to be President Johnson?
Well, what happened is that Dick had actually just been changed to go back on a new job in the White House staff. He was going to be a special assistant consultant on the arts, again, to be working with Jackie Kennedy. They were going to have somebody who would not just make the arts an elite thing, but using arts for rural areas, for places that normally didn't get theater or poetry. And he was so excited. And it leaked. He wasn't going to start for a couple weeks, but it leaked to the New York Times. So the morning of the assassination, he was at home, and John Kennedy wanted him to write the statement that would announce this new position. So he was home that morning. He hadn't heard anything. And he called the White House in the afternoon to read the statement, as he'd been asked to do from Texas by President Kennedy. And they said, oh, Mr. Goodwin, didn't you know the president's been shot? So his immediate instinct was to go to the White House. And he became part of a small team that night that were planning for the funeral arrangements. Jackie had sent word that there were how she could do this in the midst of all that turmoil still astonishes me. She wanted two things done. She wanted the East Room to be laid out as it was for Abraham Lincoln, because she wanted the body to come back to that dignified place. It wouldn't be the public viewing place, which would be the rotunda, but it would be where the body waited until it was ready for the public viewing. And she also wanted to have an eternal flame at the gravesite. And Dick was involved in both of those projects. They knew, Dick remembered that there was a book by Carl Sandburg in the cabinet room that talked about how the room looked during Lincoln's time, but it wasn't detailed enough. So they went to the Library of Congress, because it mentioned that there was a magazine called Leslie's that had an actual drawing of what it was like. So people broke into the Library of Congress that night, and they had flashlights, and they finally found the magazine article. And then they arranged that room. The catafalque came that was like Lincoln's. The black crepe was hung in the very same way, so that when Jackie came in, she could feel that sense of Abraham Lincoln, that historic sense of wanting that likeness. And then the question became how to get an eternal flame. She had seen one in Paris, so Dick got the responsibility for that. He called the generals in Paris. They said they couldn't get it there in time. It was too complicated. And they've recorded his voice. Manchester, who wrote the book, Death of a President, got it from him at the time. The general said, we can't do it. He said, you can blow up the world and you can't get this here in time. Finally, they decided all they could do was get these luau lamps that they used to use sometimes in places, have propane gas tanks, and put right near the gravesite, and then there'd be a switch where she could light it. And it worked somehow. They were so nervous about it. So that desire that Jackie had to somehow have a light there, like you'd want a little boy not to be able to, who couldn't go to sleep, to have a light, she got that wish answered.
Well, let's talk about Dick's relationship with Lyndon Johnson while Johnson was vice president. What dealings did they have? What were their feelings toward each other before LBJ became president?
He really hadn't known LBJ too well. He had done a few words for him, I think, in speeches, especially that might have to do with Latin America, which had become Dick's specialty. But after JFK died, there are journal entries and diary entries from Dick's diary where he and Bobby and the Kennedy family are talking together. And they really pissed me off when I read these entries, because they talk about Lyndon Johnson, and Bobby says, what does he know about hungry people? What does he know about people who have problems in the world? He has no idea. And I kept saying, don't you know what he became? You know, this was a man who had deep empathy for those people. There was a sense, as I said, of this fault line between the Kennedys and the Johnsons. So Dick was definitely on the Kennedy side. But then he did go over, surprisingly, to the Johnson side. We never knew exactly what it was that made Johnson reach out to Dick to become one of his speechwriters, until we found one of those tapes that Johnson had made. As you probably know, he had a button in his Oval Office, and he could press it whenever he wanted a recording of the conversation he was making. Mostly he wanted it for deals that he was making with congressmen and senators, so that they could remember what promises they had made to him. In this case, we found a tape recording of a conversation he had in March of '64. So it's only 4 or 5 months after Kennedy died, with Bill Moyers, one of his White House aides, and a close aide he was. And he says to Bill Moyers, I need someone to write my speeches. I need someone, this is what's so weird about the way he said it, who can put sex into my speeches. I need someone who can put rhythm into my speeches. I need someone who can write great Churchillian phrases. Who can that be? And Moyer said, well, the only person I know is Dick Goodwin, because he had also worked on speeches for Shriver, Dick had, when he was working in the Peace Corps, but he's not one of us, meaning he's on the Kennedy side. But Johnson decided anyway to bring him over and work on a poverty speech, and he liked what he did, worked on another one, and then eventually brought him to the White House, and he became his chief speechwriter. And in many ways, the best moments of both of their lives occurred in their collaboration together.
Well, let's talk about Dick's role in naming and creating the Great Society, which became the phrase for the Johnson presidency as far as his domestic agenda was concerned. How did that come about?
So what happened is about a month or so after Dick got there, Moyers came to him one morning and said, the president wants to see us. He wants to talk about a Johnson program. What would his legislative agenda be beyond getting past the bills that Kennedy had already sent up there? The tax cut had gotten through already under Johnson's leadership, and the civil rights bill was moving through, but he wanted a Johnson program. So Dick said, are we meeting him in the Oval Office? He said, no, we're going to the White House pool. So they go to the pool, and Johnson is in the pool, stark naked, swimming up and down, side stroking up and down the pool. And Dick said he sort of looked like a whale going up and down the pool. And they're standing there in their suits and ties, and they don't know quite what to do. And Johnson said, well, boys, come on in. I got to talk to you. So they have no choice but to strip right at that moment. So they go in the pool. Soon you have 3 naked guys swimming in the pool. This is the way the Great Society is going to be born. So what happens is finally Johnson pulls over to the side, and they're hanging on to the side of the pool, and he starts talking about what he wants to be Johnson's agenda. And he had actually, the first night he became president, he had outlined these were the things he had in mind. He wanted Medicare. He wanted federal aid to education. He wanted civil rights. He wanted voting rights. He wanted immigration reform, and so much more. So they decided that they had to have a speech to outline what his program would be, and they would need a name for what this program was. So the speech was decided would be at the University of Michigan on May 22nd, a rather, chutzpah thing to do, because that would be competitive with John Kennedy and the signature of the Peace Corps. So when you write a speech, that means it's a deadline for coming up with what the programs would be. So they already had task force out there. They had all sorts of ideas that came in, and Dick put them together in a speech. It went to the University of Michigan. And then they figured out, what are we going to call this thing? So for a while, people were debating in the White House, could it be called a better deal rather than a new deal? Could it be called the Glorious Society? Could it be called the Good Society? And finally, Dick just tried out a few of these things, and he tried out one called the Great Society, but not even in capital letters, just in and the Great Society meant, as he said in these several other smaller speeches, an affluent society, the most affluent in the world. What are its responsibilities to people who are poor, people who are hungry, people who are prejudiced against? And that's what the theme of it was going to be. So finally, it caught on in the press, and it became the Great Society. So as I say, the Great Society was born that day when 3 guys were just swimming up and down the pool.
Now, Bill Moyers once described Lyndon Johnson as 13 of the most complex people I've ever known. Did you and Dick agree on Moyers' description?
There was no question that Johnson could change in a day, in a week, in a month, from somebody outgoing to somebody withdrawn, to somebody depressed, to somebody manic, to somebody kind, to somebody mean, to somebody who could humiliate an aide one day and then send a Cadillac to their house the next day to make up for the embarrassment of the day before. So there was no steadiness. The only steadiness was really Lady Bird Johnson. Without her, and she was able to smooth people's feelings when he had hurt them. And he was difficult to work for. I mean, if you weren't there at every moment you wanted, he would be mad at you. He didn't understand why you had any other life but working for him. And yet you worked with him on things that mattered, that made a huge difference. When the Great Society legislation passed in the 89th Congress, all the people around him felt they were part of something quite magical. So yes, there was a mercurial temperament in that character, and yet it was somebody who you felt proud in the end until the war broke much of it apart to be working for it. There's no question.
Well, talk about your relationship with Lady Bird. You stayed at the LBJ Ranch for an extended period of time. Here's this young, attractive woman spending all this time with her husband. How did it go between you and Lady Bird?
She was so glad to have somebody there who could take up his time. He needed everybody to be there at every moment. So she would tell me when I was there, it was like having a camp counselor for him. I could talk to him. She could go work on her memoirs. She could go shopping. She could do whatever she wanted to. I remember there was one time, she really was an extraordinary woman. There was one time when somebody mentioned something about this young woman in a newspaper. Why was she going down to the ranch so much? And I felt when I got down there the next weekend that I had a scarlet letter on. I was a terribly scared, sad feeling to think that somebody was thinking of something other than what it was. She came up to me and said, well, you're not going to let these newspapers bother us. We know that we're part of the same family, in other words, she said. And that lasted really through the rest of her life. I mean, something happened that I'll never forget. In about a year after Team of Rivals was published, so now we're talking about 2005, 2006, Lucy, their daughter, called me up and said that her mother had just listened to Team of Rivals on the audio, and she wanted me to know how much she loved it. And I couldn't figure out what she could do because I knew she'd had a stroke several years before, that she could no longer speak. And so Lucy just said, just wait a minute. And then on the other end of the phone, I heard Lady Bird clapping. It was just an incredibly emotional moment. And then Lucy is so dramatic. I called her later when I was writing the book so that I could make sure that that was my right memory about it. And she said, oh, yes, I remember. She started clapping, and she clapped louder and louder and louder. She wanted you to know how proud she was of you and how much a part of our family you were. So she was the woman that without whom his stability would have been impossible. She made everything possible.
Now, LBJ's greatest speech was written by Dick. It's the We Shall Overcome speech, which was right after Bloody Sunday in Selma, Alabama, and the day before he submitted the strong voting rights bill to Congress, which became the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So you later worked for the man who gave the speech and married the man who wrote the speech. So what does that speech mean to you personally?
Oh, I remember listening when I was with my graduate student friends to Bloody Sunday. What had happened is raw footage was taken of that event on Edmund Pettus Bridge when the peaceful marchers led by John Lewis were walking across the bridge, and the Alabama state troopers tore into the crowd with their clubs and their whips, and then they brought their horses into the crowd and went over the fallen bodies, and people were hospitalized. And in those days, you couldn't do a television show right from there. They had to fly the raw footage to Atlanta, finally got up to New York in time to break into Sunday evening programs. And we were watching in graduate school Judgment at Nuremberg. They used to have a Sunday movie on, and it broke into the movie and showed that footage. And I remember we all just said to ourselves, this can't be our country. This is such a sad thing to watch. And what it had done is all over the country, it had fired the conscience of the American people. Johnson had been waiting to introduce voting rights until the following year because he knew the Civil Rights Act, ending segregation in the South, had passed in July of 1964, and we needed time to absorb those huge changes in daily life in the South. But now he knew this was the moment he had to go for voting rights. So he decided on a Sunday night that he would give a speech on Monday night to a joint session of Congress. That would normally take weeks to prepare. And Dick, as the main speechwriter, had only Monday to work on that speech. And I just was in awe when I saw the drafts of that speech and how it was collaborated on with Lyndon Johnson. And it becomes an historic speech in our nation's history. He always had what he did when he first got in that morning and was told he had to have it done by 6 o'clock that night. He put his watch in a drawer, as if by putting his watch away, time wouldn't pass. I mean, kind of nuts in a way. But he then decided, I have to get the first line. Always the first. That's why I think when any of us write, the first line of any chapter, the first line of any book, the first line of an essay in high school is the hardest thing to do. So it took him a long time to get it. Once he got it, he had the rhythm going. And that first line was, it's a beautiful line. I speak tonight for the dignity of man and the destiny of democracy. And then he went on from there to say, at times history and fate meet at a certain place in a certain time. So it was in Lexington and Concord. So it was at Appomattox. So it was in Selma, Alabama. This is not a Negro problem, not a white problem, not a Northern problem, not a Southern problem. It is an American problem, and we are met here tonight, not as Democrats and Republicans, but as Americans to meet that problem. The audience was responding more and more as he kept going. And then finally he said, but even if we get the right to vote, we have to overcome a century of bigotry and prejudice. And then he said, but if we do that, and then he paused and he said, we shall overcome. And what had happened in the afternoon, Dick took a break. He smoked cigars endlessly. He went out to smoke a cigar. And in the distance, he heard some people singing, we shall overcome. And then he remembered then the March on Washington and the anthem of the Civil Rights Movement. And by bringing it into the speech, it meant that you're bringing the ground movement from the outside into the highest councils of power, a joint session of Congress. And that's when change takes place. It was said that that night when Martin Luther King heard that moment, that he cried, something he seldom did. And for me, as you were saying, I was listening to my graduate student friends, that same group that had been in judgment at Nuremberg. And when we heard that, we just jumped up and with tears in our eyes and hugged each other as if we were part of the whole thing. And then the only moment that Johnson interrupted him that whole day when he was working on the speech was he called him up, and Dick said it was the softest voice he'd ever did. He didn't normally talk to his aides in a soft voice. And he said, Dick, I don't mean to interrupt you, but I'd like to talk about Cthulhu. And Dick knew what that meant. Johnson had taken a year off from teaching at Southwest State Teachers College to go work because he needed the money. And he went to be a principal and a teacher and a coach, everything at this small Mexican-American school in Cthulhu, Texas. And he realized that the kids were coming to school without having anything to eat, that they knew that somehow people didn't like them, but they weren't sure why. They were people of color. And he wanted to do what he could for them, but there was very little he could do. But he said to Dick, but I want to say something about Cthulhu in this speech. So Dick wrote a passage that was perfectly in tune with what he knew from Johnson, because Johnson had talked to him about Cthulhu many times. And in the speech, he then said, after the We Shall Overcome part, he said, in 1928, when I was there with those kids, there was so little I could do. I gave half my salary to get athletic equipment for them, but that was about it. But now it's 1965, and those kids have kids, and they have kids, and I have power. I am president of the United States, and I intend to use it. And that was another moment when vulnerably making himself, telling a personal story, that the crowd erupted. And then 5 months later, the Voting Rights Act passed, and one of the proudest things we had on our wall before my husband died, and it's now on my wall, is a picture of Dick shaking hands with LBJ and one of the actual pens that was used for the signing of that voting rights, which really changed, like the Civil Rights Act, those two major acts changed our country, not just the South. It brought the country together in moving forward on civil rights.
So they were bonded over civil rights and voting rights and totally in sync. And then all of a sudden, the Vietnam War escalates, and not much time passes before they split. And Dick was characteristically very open in his criticisms of the escalation of the war and the way President Johnson was handling it. And President Johnson understandably thought he had been betrayed by his loyal speechwriter. So do you think it was hard for Dick to so aggressively attack a president who he had been so close to just a few months before?
Yeah, it really was a difficult situation. I mean, at first when he left Johnson, it wasn't really that he was so much against the war in Vietnam. He saw that the war was beginning to take attention away from the Great Society, but he really wanted to become a writer, and he knew if he didn't leave soon, he was never going to have that chance, and he'd gotten a fellowship at Wesleyan. So it was in the fall of 65 that he wanted to leave, and he gave Johnson much notice. Johnson said, you just can't go. And then he gave him all sorts of incentives to stay. You know, you want more money, you can have that. Do you want a cabin on the lake? You can have that. Same things he offered to me later on. And we didn't realize that he had this whole things that he would ask anybody to do. We thought it was so special that he was asking each of us to do these things. Finally, he said to him, you know, you can't go. There's a legislation that you can draft people who are necessary for the public interest. I'll just draft you. That's what'll happen. And Dick thought he must be kidding, but he called McNamara and he found out there was such a law. But then anyway, finally, Johnson accepted that he was going, and the relationship was kind of cold at that point, but not bitter, until Johnson then heard that Dick had written against the war and had given the first public speech as an administration official against the war. And then the more and more Dick got into the anti-war movement, the anger he got about what the war was doing itself, a terrible war, he thought, not the right war to be fought, what it was doing to America, what the credibility gap that is developing was doing to trust in the government. And he turned really virulently, almost as if you're heartbroken that somebody you loved had betrayed you. And then Johnson felt the same thing on the other end, that Dick had betrayed him. So it was a sad thing until, as I said at the beginning, that Dick finally came to terms, as I think the country has come to terms with Lyndon Johnson. 50th anniversaries were happening in those last years of Dick's life, and people would come up and interview him about the staying power of Medicare or the staying power of civil rights and voting rights. And even on historians' polls now, as you know, Johnson's coming up continually. In fact, on a most recent poll, not one of the C-SPAN ones, but a recent one, Johnson was number 8 on the polls of ranking. Kennedy was 9. Johnson would have been very happy to see that poll.
Well, the escalation of the Vietnam War and all the nationwide protests that arose therefrom really came to a head in 1968, maybe the most traumatic year in recent American history anyway. On March 31, LBJ announced he would not seek re-election. On April 14, MLK was assassinated. On June the 4th, Robert Kennedy was assassinated. In late August, there were riots at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, and in November, Nixon defeated Humphrey, who had been LBJ's vice president. Now, you were a White House fellow that year in 1968 in very close proximity to President Johnson. How did he handle the stress of that year?
Oh, it was a really hard year for him. And if I could unpack a little bit what you were saying, because it's really the same understanding how fate intervened, just as we see here at the museum when you see, as I say, that exhibit of those 2 days that were so happy before the assassination here in Dallas. And Stephen was telling me that one of the last things that JFK heard before he died from Nellie Connolly was, "Now you see, Mr. President, Dallas really does love you," because they came out in droves to see him everywhere here. And those were the last words he heard. Well, so too, that chronology that you described. Yes, Dick was involved. Since Bobby wouldn't run in the campaign, he wasn't willing to start being an opponent of Lyndon Johnson's yet. He was afraid he would break the Democratic Party in two. So Senator McCarthy took the lead in going up to New Hampshire. And Dick went to Bobby and said, "If you're not going to do it, I've got to go up there and help him." So he helped McCarthy, and McCarthy did very well in that primary. Kids came from all over the country, and they shed their beards, they cut their long hair, the girls wore long dresses, shedding the mini dresses. And they went to every Democratic house in New Hampshire. And New Hampshire was a kind of hawkish state, but they told them, they just listened to them. "Wouldn't you like to have the chaos of the country? And wouldn't you like things to be back stable? McCarthy's your man." And that campaign, Dick said, was one of the happiest campaigns he was part of. So then what happened is a couple weeks later, just as Talmage said, Lyndon Johnson made a major speech to the country saying that he was going to negotiate the war and that he was going to stop the bombing and that he was going to withdraw from the race. He knew then, not just because of the campaign, not just because he probably might have done badly in Wisconsin primary and it was going to be a tough road to the presidency, but the people the generals had come to him and said, "We need 200,000 more people if we're going to keep a stalemate." And he finally realized from some of the people who were able to tell him the truth that this was just going to go on, and he had to draw an end to it. So he hoped that by withdrawing from the race, he could spend his last months really getting a peace in Vietnam. And as you say, I mean, after March 31st, there were some moments when he went around the streets and people were no longer saying, "Hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today?" They were saying, "Thank you, Mr. President." Editorials in the Washington Post and the New York Times said he had sacrificed himself for the country. And he was really so happy to think maybe something can happen. And then 2 days later, the North Vietnamese sent word that they were willing to come to the bargaining table. The entire White House plane had been filled on April 4th to go to Hawaii, and Johnson was going to join them later that night, join the plane to start the talks with the generals over there. And just that evening, he got the word that Martin Luther King had been shot. And as you said, then riots broke out in the cities. He couldn't go to Hawaii. The trip was called off. The peace talks stalled. They kept going on forward, and they worried about whether it was a round table or a square table. And by the time of the Democratic Convention, frustrations had built in the anti-war community. Many of the peaceful people that came there were from the McCarthy campaign, wanting a peace plank in the platform. Dick was there in charge of the peace plank after Bobby Kennedy had died. I mean, that death, it really took something away from Dick the rest of his life. He loved Bobby. He was with him when he died. He was in that campaign. And he really thought that Bobby could have been an even deeper president in some ways from JFK, having absorbed the death of JFK. Hemingway once said, "Everyone is broken by life, but afterwards some are strong in the broken places." And I think that was true for Bobby. He had been very judgmental before. Everything was right or wrong, and he softened that, and he became more empathetic and more compassionate. And Dick really thought he was in the presence of somebody who combined some of the strengths of JFK, but had his own strengths because of what he'd been through, having loved JFK more than anyone in his life. So all of that sadness was then channeled again into the anti-war movement, and he was at that Democratic convention, and so was I. Now, I wasn't there as somebody who was working for Lyndon Johnson. It was just my vacation. I had gone there. And I knew how much sadness it was for Lyndon Johnson not to be able to go to that convention. But once I got there, I was with all my anti-war friends, and I was feeling very mixed again about where are my values? I thought this war was the most important thing, and then became convinced as a White House fellow working for Johnson that the domestic stuff was really important too, and I could put the war to one side. But now suddenly the war had loomed its head high. So I said to myself, if he asks me to do anything while I'm here for him, I won't do it. This will be my stand. So at one point I was with all my friends there, and I got a call. They said it was the president calling me. And I thought, oh my God, this is going to be it. I'm going to have to make a decision. And he called and he said, I have a favor to ask you. And I thought, here it comes. And he said, last week when you were here, you borrowed my flashlight, and I don't know where it is. Where is it? I thought, oh my God, this is so embarrassing. So anyway, but then I said to him finally, how are you? And he said, well, how do you think I am? I feel terrible. This is my party. It's been my party for 30 odd years, and I can't even go. They were going to celebrate his birthday just as they had in 1964, because it came at the end of August, and he was going to fly in. They had a big cake ready, and they tell me that I can't even come. I'm too disliked to come. How do you think I feel? And then all of a sudden, I felt that empathy for LBJ again. It was a very, very hard time for him. And the only thing that he was beginning to feel like he would have some chance at was working on the memoirs. And then hopefully he could tell his story, not just about Vietnam, but about the domestic accomplishments. So this became a source of problem for him and me, because he wanted me to come and work full time for him. He said I could stay in Austin during the week and go through the papers, which were then in Austin before the library was even built. And then I could come to the ranch and live on the weekends. But I just knew I wanted to go back to Harvard and start teaching. So I said, I'd love to work for you, and I can come every other weekend. I'll come on vacations. I'll come in the summers. I'll come part-time. And he said, nope, it's all or nothing. It's all or nothing. So everything seemed like it wasn't going to happen. But then that Christmas vacation, I was at the ranch, and then he was really angry with me at that point. And this is when I experienced his anger. And the way he would experience to me, but not yelling, but it was ice. That was what he would do. He would ice somebody out when he was mad at them. So it meant that he would come in a room and pretend I wasn't even there. He wouldn't look at me. He would talk to the other people as if I didn't exist. Lady Bird saw what he was doing, and once again, she came to the rescue. So the last day of his presidency, he called me into the Oval Office, and everything's being dismantled. Nixon's coming in the next day. And as I walk in the office in a very gruff voice, he said, all right, part-time. So luckily I ended up, and I think about it now, I would have lost how I was being so certain that I could only make this deal, that I could go part-time. There was no way I knew that he was going to accept that. I would have given up that chance to have really known him, to have helped on those memoirs, and to have had that experience that's when you're young, you don't know what you're doing, but luckily Lady Bird saved me in many ways.
So he enters retirement, works with you on his memoirs, and in March 1970, you visited him in a San Antonio hospital after he had suffered an angina attack. And he asked you then, how do you think I'll be remembered? What was your answer then, and how would you answer the question now?
Yeah, at the time, it just seemed like he was thinking that he was not going to live very long, and I was just concerned about him having the will to keep going. So I said, no, it's much too early. We don't want to talk about that. So I sort of put off that question. I wasn't going to start talking about him dying when it didn't seem yet that he still had another 2 years, as it turned out, to live. Though that heart attack had really been on his mind for a long period of time. And interestingly, for him, what happened is he had a first major heart attack when he was in his 40s still, and he was Senate Majority Leader. And he was very seriously ill, and he was in the hospital, and he couldn't come out of the depression that the heart attack had let him in. They couldn't really wake him up. They said it was almost like he was not willing to come back. And all of a sudden, then one day he came back and he said, "Okay, everybody, get me shaved, get the hospital going. Everything should start clicking again. I'm here." And later asked what happened. He said, "Well, I was lying there and thinking, what if I died now? What would I be remembered for?" Yes, he had made a lot of money. He was a powerful majority leader, but what had he done with that power that he had? And so it was that day that he decided he wanted to do something with his power. He went back to the Senate as majority leader, and he got the first civil rights bill through the Senate. It was a moderate bill, had to do with voting rights, but it was the first time that a civil rights bill had passed since Reconstruction, and he felt the fulfillment of that. And that meant that that night, as I say, when he became president, he knew this is what he wanted to do. And in fact, he made the passage of JFK's civil rights bill his first priority in the first speech he made after JFK's death. And his friends said to him, you shouldn't do that. You're setting yourself up for a failure. That bill will never get through. The Democratic Party is split in two. You'll go to the election in November, your own election, and you'll have been a failed leader. And they said, you only have a certain amount of currency to expend. You can't expend it on this. So then he famously said, then what the hell is the presidency for? And then he set to work. He was able to get a bipartisan group of people, including Everett Dirksen, the minority leader of the Republican Party, to join the Northern Democrats to break that filibuster, to get that two-thirds vote. And the conversations with Everett Dirksen are just magical. And what do you want, Dirksen? You want to have a dam? You want a public works project? You want me to come to Peoria, Springfield? I'll do anything. But finally, he persuades him by saying, you know, Everett, if you come with me on this bill and you bring some Republicans, 200 years from now, school children will know only two names, Abraham Lincoln and Everett Dirksen. How could Dirksen resist? So he brings the 22 Republicans to join the 44 Northern Democrats, a bipartisan showing that was so important for this most important bill to pass. So I think that I would say that his dream in those last years when I knew LBJ on the ranch, and we would walk around and he would point to the graves of his parents, you know, here's my daddy and mommy, and I will be here someday too. A beautiful place on the LBJ ranch. And he just said, I hope that at least civil rights will be remembered along with the war in Vietnam. And it has been remembered, as I say, not just by historians, polls, but by people, I think, who realize, the civil rights community certainly realizes that perhaps without his bipartisan leadership, those great civil rights laws might not have gotten through. And what he did in the Great Society had much to do with social justice, things like Medicare. And I think that he will slowly, as the war will always be something to cut that legacy in two, and especially his not handling of the war in a way that people understood exactly what was going on, his credibility undermined, and the trust in government never having fully recovered after that Watergate and so many other things that happened. But I think as we go on in time, those achievements will be seeming even more monumental than they were at the time.
Now, for my last question, toward the end of the book, as you described Dick's failing health that led to his death in 2018, you said that by opening the boxes and working toward the book became your talisman, which you describe as an object thought to have magical powers that brings luck. So what magic flowed from this final great collaboration that you had with your late great husband?
I think part of it was that we just felt as long as we had more boxes to open, and he'd have to keep staying alive. He used to say sometimes, I wonder what will finish first, me or the boxes. And there were still boxes to go when he did die. But they gave him, as I said at the beginning, just a sense of such purpose and joy in those last months of his life that he fought the cancer until it finally reached him. But he was able to keep going really much longer than I think he would have, because he had this project in mind. And I think the project has to do with what all of us want to do, which is to somehow be remembered after we die for having done something worthwhile. You know, it may not be on Mount Rushmore, it may not be in monuments, it may not be in movies or articles that are written about us, but it'll be in the stories that our friends and our colleagues and our children tell about us. And it's one of the things that I thought about in working on this book, that I think it's so important. My hope would be that young people who will read it will ask their grandparents to tell them stories of what it was like to live during this period of time, because it's too late to wait until somebody dies and then open the photograph books that stood in an attic or the letters that might have been somewhere else in your house. It'd be wonderful if it could spur conversations between the generations so that the stories of the people we love, private people we've loved, who are going to pass before us can be told to that next generation so people can live on. And that's really my sense of why history is so important. It's not just the history of famous people, it's the history of all of us, the history of our parents and grandparents. And somehow, and when I just even going back to my father died before I got married, so my 3 sons never were able to meet him. But I passed his love of baseball on to my sons, even though once the Dodgers abandoned us, I refused to even watch baseball for a while until I went to Harvard, went to Fenway Park, and became an equally irrational Red Sox fan. So there were so many times when I'd be sitting with my boys at Fenway Park, and I could just imagine myself a young girl once more in the presence of my father, watching the players on my youth on the grassy fields below. I could see in my mind Jackie Robinson and Pee Wee Reese and Duke Snider and Gil Hodges, and then open my eyes and see my sons in the place where my father once sat. I could feel an invisible kind of a loyalty and love between my sons and the grandfather whose face they never had the chance to see, but whose heart and soul they've come to know through the stories I've told. So in the end, I guess this book and all the other books that I've written trying to bring presidents back to life is just a way of making history part of our present day. And in our time right now, I think in this beleaguered time, it's so important to remember, especially those times that have been turbulent, the times that have been far worse than the times we're living in now, but the times we came through with greater strength. So we've got to just believe we'll do that in this time again. There'll be something that comes together to heal these wounds that may take a long period of time, but I suspect that this is still the greatest country in the world. Dick believed that. In fact, one of the things he wrote in those last years of his life was a story about how from the time of the beginning, we've had all sorts of vicissitudes. And he talked about the Civil War and the Great Depression and the early days of World War II. And then he ended it with the thought, we've come through those times before, we'll do it again. America is not as fragile as it seems. This was written in the time of great troubles in these last years, and I believe that as well.
Well, Nikolai, in her introduction, referenced that yesterday you were named one of the 250 ambassadors for our 250-year anniversary of our country. And I promised your great friend Beth that I would ask you this. What things come to mind immediately with this horrible polarization that our society now has? What things come to mind that you want to be an advocate for in an effort to try to break down walls and bring people together? We have David McCullough III back here, who has a wonderful organization I know you're a part of that's trying to bring young people together from all over the country. But I think our audience wants to hear your thoughts on what we can do going forward to help bring people
think
together.
the most important thing we have to do, one of the things Teddy Roosevelt warned against at the turn of the 20th century was if we get in a situation where people in different parties or sections or religions begin seeing each other as the other rather than as common American citizens, that's when democracy will be in peril. We have to break down that otherness that now exists in our country. People from different parties who view each other as the enemies, people from different parts of the country who don't understand the values of the people in the country versus the city. And it's something that David McCullough, the grandson of David McCullough, my great historian friend, is doing in a wondrous way. It's something called the American Exchange. And a bunch of these kids were here today going through the museum. I was able to meet them. I've been hearing about this program for the last couple of years. So he brings kids from different parts of the country together. A group of them are in Dallas today, and they came from all different states, from Nevada, from Massachusetts, from Louisiana, from various parts of the country. And they join together and they hear about each other's, they're seniors, they hear about each other's high schools, they hear about the lives they've had, and then they go to the rituals and the places that belong in that hometown. And then another group of kids goes back to the other groups. So they're learning how to live with each other as different people, and they've already formed friendships. I mean, as David was saying, we're in that mental health crisis for so many adolescents right now, and maybe the chance of just going away, even for a week, as these kids do, and they do a service project one of those days of the week, by being together with other kids and making new friends, friends who seem to come from very different lives, maybe that's the way we can break down that. If the younger generation can break down the things that are pulling us apart right now. What's hard to understand about our country is how party has become such a dividing line. It was that way long ago. George Washington warned against the spirit of party. But it seems now, I mean, in 1958, there was a poll that asked people, how would you care if your daughter married somebody outside the party? How many of you would care? Only 20% cared whether they married a Democrat or Republican. Over 77%, it's fine, whoever they marry. Now they say that 79% of new marriages are people of the same party. I mean, that makes no sense at all, that should be our identity. It's one of the ways we organize for political activities, but we should be able to reach across those lines, to reach across country, city, to reach across West, East, and be able to become common American citizens. So I'm hoping that this program that David is doing, that the 250th anniversary, when we begin to remember the times when America was together, I mean, that's what D-Day did. Just listening to those stories on television again on June 6th, it had to make you proud of what America did when we came together. The military does it so successfully, and maybe these domestic kind of programs, internal Peace Corps could do it, but maybe we ourselves can just tell our young people that we've known what it was like to work together. We who are older saw it happen, and it was problems created by man can be solved by man. We just have to believe that and have the confidence. And I'm hoping the 250th will be a time when we remember the founding of this country and the things we've been through together. Even when the anniversary of suffrage came, I realized how little I knew about what the women had gone through. Even I, as an historian, we hadn't been taught it that much, what the women had to go through to get that right to vote. And when you think about what everybody's gone through to get where we are now, we have to respect ourselves and respect our institutions once again. Government is us. We're the citizens. We've got to make it happen.
Absolutely.
All the change that's taken place, it's never from the top. That's what Dick wrote in that piece of paper. He said, I'm not looking for heroes anymore. It's up to us, the citizens. When Lincoln was called a liberator, he said, don't call me that. It was the anti-slavery movement that did it all, and the Union soldiers. It was the progressive movement that was already in the streets, in the settlement houses, and in the social gospel and religion at the turn of the 20th century that allowed Teddy Roosevelt to deal with the problems of the Industrial Revolution. It was the union movement in the 30s. It was the civil rights movement in the 60s. It was the gay rights movement and the women's movement in the 60s. All the changes have taken place from the citizens up. So if citizens just can take that responsibility again and begin arguing and writing in the right kind of way for the changes we need, I think we're going to be just fine.
Well, on the one hand, we were going to have questions from the audience, but on the other hand, it's a little after 1. And I know everybody wants Doris to sign your book. So, okay, we have a couple of questions. Who has, yes, sir.
Well, the one thing I remember the most about Caroline and John Jr. is that we were invited to the bridal dinner the night before the wedding and to the wedding itself of Caroline and Ed Schlossberg. And at that wedding, John Jr. gave a toast to his sister Caroline, and it was a beautiful toast, just saying that all our lives, there's just been 3 of us, and now there's 4, and he welcomed his new brother-in-law. And I went to Jackie and I said, I had 2 of my younger kids were only 15 months apart. I said, and they were still fighting in the car at the back at the time. And I kept saying, I just hope they become best friends like Caroline and John had been. And then she said to me, it's the best thing I've ever done. So in that moment, she looked straight in my eyes, and I knew that mattered to her a lot.
Doris Kearns Goodwin's fantastic new book is a combination memoir and presidential history, and it's a tour de force read for those who embrace history writing at its highest level. I hope you enjoyed this podcast. Make sure and catch all my podcasts at Spotify, iTunes, SoundCloud, and the Washington Independent Review of Books. Until next time, remember, as my late great friend Bobby Bragan used to say, you can't hit the ball with the bat on your shoulder. This is Talmage Boston of the law firm Shackelford, McKinley & Norton. Thanks for listening.